You're watching Beyond Markets. Welcome. I'm Esther Awuni. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll discuss the growth expectations for Nigeria's maritime industry. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther Awuni. Now, the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency, NIMASA, says it requires the collaboration of stakeholders in the maritime industry as it plans to explore all opportunities in the sector to drive growth. Dr. Dakuku Peterside, Director General of the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency, joins me to discuss growth expectations for the country's maritime industry this year. Thank you for taking the time out to join us today.
Thank you, viewers, and thank you, Esther.
You've put up a forecast for 2019, but before we go to that forecast and what we can expect in terms of growth, in terms of helping the government to further diversify the economy, let's start with, let's go quickly to 2016 when you became Director General. You had a strategic implementation plan to run for 3 years. Talk to us about that plan, what the sector was like when you started, and to what extent that plan has helped to grow the sector or change things at NIMASA.
All right, thank you very much, Esther. In 2016, when I was appointed Chief Executive to join Team NIMASA, we all sat down on the table and clearly identified where we are in the sector, what's our role, how far have we accomplished that role. Now, that review led us to two important things. One is that we identified we had a reputation problem, which we needed to be dealt with. The second thing is that we needed a new focus on where we're headed. And we identified that we wanted to be the foremost maritime administration in Africa, advancing Nigeria's maritime goals. The third was how do we achieve that? That led to the articulation of what is called the NIMASA Medium-Term Strategic Plan, and for short, the Strategic Implementation Plan. Okay. Of how we want to get to where we want to get to, the vision from where we are. And that is itself built on 5 pillars. The first pillar is a survey, inspection and certification transformation initiative. The second one, of course, is environment, security, transformation initiative. The third is capacity building and promotion initiative. The fourth is structural and cultural reforms. And the fifth is digital transformation strategy, digital strategy. And so we identified the 5 pillars under which we can run to transform the maritime sector by transforming NIMASA and place her where we want her to be. Make her the foremost maritime administration in Africa, and not just being the foremost, driving economic growth in the country of Nigeria, and helping create opportunities for our people, creating jobs, creating wealth for our people. And so the question is, how far have we gone with the implementation of that strategic plan, which is anchored on 5 pillars? I can say this, I'm not in the best position to assess myself, being a member of Team NIMASA, but I think that of all the elements we've identified, we've accomplished more than 75%. And this year, we're focusing on closing out everything we say we're going to do under the NIMASA Strategic Implementation Plan or the NIMASA Medium-Term Strategy Plan. I believe that by the end of this year, we'll have achieved virtually everything we said we're going to do under that Strategic Implementation Plan.
What were those issues or those factors, those challenges that were crippling the sector that called for a change of strategy, and to what extent have you been able to address them?
Yeah, well, I'll just highlight a few. One is that we identified the fact that we had a reputation problem. We had to engage in rebranding. And in rebranding, we had to do internal rebranding, change our work ethics, change our customer relations mentality. We're a regulatory agency. At the time, customer relations concept was still strange in a regulatory agency. All we think about is enforcement, compliance. Now, but we tweaked the way we do enforcement to partnership. Now, getting stakeholders in the industry to understand why they need to comply with the rules or regulations, why the compliance with rules of safety, with rules of engagement will help everybody in the sector. So we changed that from pure enforcement to partnership to achieve the same result, compliance. Now, the other issue we dealt with, it was how to mainstream the issues of environment in shipping. And that, again, we moved stakeholders from just seeing environment as distinct from shipping to seeing environment as part of integrated shipping program. Now, the other thing was to focus on security. We developed what is called the NIMASA Total Maritime Security Spectrum Strategy to sort out the issue of security. Now, we also dealt with the issue of how do we increase our tonnage. To that extent, we agreed that there's need to reform our ship registration office, the Nigerian Ship Registration Office. And so the other one is to build tonnage capacity. How do we engage more persons to participate in the industry? At the time, our picture, the bigger picture, was for us to double the number of Nigerians participating in the sector. And so to do that, we needed to train more people, get new skill sets, and get more persons involved. The other one, we identified the fact that financing remains a challenge. If we want to increase our assets acquisition capacity, we need to look at alternative sources of financing. Yes, the CVFF is there, but aside from the CVFF, we need other sources of financing. We have since commenced engagement with the Central Bank of Nigeria towards creating a single-digit facility for the shipping sector. We've also commenced engagement with the customs so that we'll create a special tariff scheme for importing of vessels and vessel parts. We've opened communication with the Federal Ministry of Finance. We've opened communication with the presidency to create a number of incentives for those who are interested in shipping. So these are some of the interventions that we identified in the medium-term strategic plan for which we are pursuing holistically and diligently.
When you also came in as DG, you also talked about the fact that, I mean, obviously, it was also at the time when we were Nigeria was looking to step up its economic diversification efforts. And you also did mention the fact that exploring the full potential of Nigeria's maritime industry would help unlock, more in investments and just, help Nigeria diversify the economy. To what extent would you say the sector has contributed to economic growth for the country?
Yeah, you're very right. I rightly identify the fact that the blue economy, not just the narrow shipping sector, the blue economy is the next big thing that can happen to Nigeria and remains, for us, the most veritable platform for us to diversify our economy. We've put a number of things in place. There are still challenges, and we're dealing with those challenges. One of the challenges we're dealing with is the issue of financing. Fund remains an issue. Security remains, or maritime security remains an issue. Those two are issues. There are many other issues. We are reforming the regulatory environment. We are providing incentives to get people to invest in the sector. We have embarked on massive enlightenment so that people understand the potentials in the sector. And one of the things we've done is the forecast, the Nigerian Maritime Forecast, to expose to people, to shed light the opportunity in the sector so that more persons will invest in the sector. So we've taken a number of initiatives, but there are still challenges. Until we deal with those challenges, we will not maximize benefit in the sector.
I know you,
and I've identified those challenges.
You've been quoted as saying that for 2019, we'll get to the forecast in a minute. You've been quoted as saying that for 2019, Nigeria, the sector can earn as much as over 10 trillion naira, about $30 billion US, if there's perhaps better stakeholder involvement, and if some of the factors you mentioned, funding, if we could get that right, we could actually see that amount of funding coming into the sector. Could you elaborate more on that?
Now, what we said is that in the year 2019, from elementary data, accumulated over the years, if you have minimum of 5,000 vessels call at our ports, bring in goods, and 5,000 leave. Now, it simply means that in that period, Nigeria will be spending so much on freight, both inbound freight and outbound freight. Nigerians are not key players in that sector now. It's dominated by foreigners in terms of ocean-going vessels. If Nigerians were to be involved, we will earn close to the amount you referred to in our country. But because we are not involved, foreigners are taking away all this much money in the name of freight. Now, in terms of cabotage vessels working in the local waters, we have also not maximized benefit. And so the Nigerian Content Development Board had estimated the expenditure for the year under review, and that Nigerians can at best get 60% of this. Our target is to get 100% of industry spend on maritime sector. We're not getting it. It means foreigners will also benefit from it. And so these are potentials.
But what is the strategy to get more local players on board?
One is funding. Funding, the ultimate end is to enhance our capacity. Assets acquisition. If you don't acquire assets, you can't be involved in international shipping. If you don't acquire assets, you can't be involved in cabotage regime. And so we must deal with this issue of funding so that people can access funds to participate in the local cabotage trade as well as international trade.
Are there conversations
now,
going on?
One is human capacity building.
Because I want us to break them down, because you've talked about, what needs to be done. So the issue is, what is being done? Are there conversations open? Are we talking to the players?
What's been done, just like you said, is that we've opened conversations with CBN. We've simply said to CBN, these are potentials in the sector. We back it with numbers, back it with trend, back it with data. And that this is the challenge we're facing. If we could get a single interest facility, as we've done for agriculture, as we've done for other sectors, then we can tap from this potential. We've opened communication with the presidency that with these incentives, you will get this number of persons participating in the industry, and we will create this employment. We also create this wealth. We will contribute this much to GDP. Every assertion we make, we back with data. Now, we've also opened communication with customs. Now, our people are not going to be competitive. Our local players are not going to be competitive because those who are bringing vessels to do short-term trade get a different tariff for bringing vessels to do short-term trade. Those who are importing vessels are charged so much tariff that they're discouraged. They can't compete. And so, please, can you create a special tariff regime for those who are importing vessels to our country and those who are bringing spare parts to our country? And we're making progress with that conversation. We're also holding a conversation with NNPC. Please, can we look at the possibility of changing terms of trade from free on board, which is the current regime, to cost insurance and freight, which will give Nigerians rights to partake in oil and gas cargo affreightment.
What about capacity on the part of the players themselves? It's one thing to not just throw money at them. Do they have capacity?
No, it's not to throw money alone. The record that I said, apart from asset acquisition, the other challenge is growing human capacity. And in growing human capacity is three-dimensional. Dimension number one, seafarers. Dimension number two, ship management skill. Dimension number three, ancillary services, whether you call it insurance, maritime law, and all the other ancillary services related to the sector. We want to grow capacity in all of them. Seafarers and those who work on board. We want to grow capacity of those who support the industry and want to grow capacity in terms of ship management and ship operations.
Mr. Dakuku Peterside, we'll take a short break. Well, thank you for your time so far, but we'll take a short break and we'll be right back to pick up from where we left off. I've been speaking to Dakuku Peterside. He's the Director General of the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency. We're looking at the growth of the sector and, of course, what to expect in 2019. If you're just joining us, Dakuku Peterside, Director General of the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency, NIMASA, is with me today. And we're discussing the growth expectations for Nigeria's maritime industry. We thank you for your time so far. Let's go right to the 2019 forecast, what we can expect in terms of growth and going down to some specifics. But first of all, you're forecasting a growth of between 8.15 to 8.72, a growth in demand for non-oil tanker and upward increase in demand for container vessels simultaneously. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, last year in our forecast, we predicted an 8.7 upward rise in demand for non-oil tankers, as well as container vessels. That didn't happen for a number of reasons, but my happiness is that we achieved between 7.5 and 8% increase in demand for non-oil tankers. And of course, it's a hint on more agricultural-based products from Nigeria, as well as gas products. Now, Train 7 was not completed. Hopefully, it will be Train 7 of the LNG was not completed. Hopefully, it will be completed in the year under review between 2019 and 2020. And the moment that is completed, of course, you know that it will lead to more exports or more demand for non-oil tanker vessels. Now, the other thing is that more agricultural yield will also, and Nigeria is of course focusing on agriculture, will lead to more exports of products too. And so that's that in that respect.
Okay, so what are your other focus for this year? I know that you're also particular about stakeholder engagement.
Yes, this year we've identified what will be the drivers, the domestic drivers of growth in the industry, domestic drivers of what will affect our productivity or output in the sector. And we identified three. One is the elections. The elections present different scenarios. If the president wins the elections, we expect consistency in policy. If the opposition wins the election, we expect that there will be new regime in terms of policy. If
when you say new regime, are you saying that there might be policy somersault? Are you saying that some of the policies that are working
it's possible
may be
if you have a new regime? You know,
but if it's working, because I've always had that conversation with people, and I keep asking the question: if the policy has been working or is working and it's seen,
nobody's going to change a working policy. But you know,
why change it?
What we're saying is that with a new president,
comes with possibility.
Possibility, yeah. Exactly. Now the other one is agriculture. Will Nigeria remain consistently focused on agriculture? If it does, we'll export more, and so that will influence demands. The third one is, of course, what happens in the oil and gas industry. Now, will China and US continue to demand for more oil? It means we'll export more. Now, will LNG Train 7 be completed? We'll export more. So, in terms of domestic drivers, three are key: the outcome of the elections, agriculture, oil and gas industry. There are other factors that will determine what will happen, you know, in the year under review. Then, at the international level, the US-China trade war will continue to be a factor. Now, what will happen with the US-China trade war? Will the US be more protectionist in their approach? It means that they will take fewer things from countries of Africa and other regions of the world. Now, will China continue to increase the demand for oil to power its industry? Now, mind you, China, for a very long time now, is beginning to experience slowdown in growth. You know what some persons have referred to as globalization instead of globalization. Globalization. China is beginning to explain. Now, the same applies to the US too. The US economy is also beginning to shrink. If the US economy is shrinking, they will demand far less from what they used to demand before. If China's growth is beginning to slow down, of course, they will demand less. If growth begin again to spike, they will demand more. So what happens between those two economic world powers will affect what happens in our local industry here.
So you've created that means you've created three different scenarios for how...
Exactly. For each one, there's an optimistic view, there's a pessimistic view, then there is a baseline. If things remain the way they are, optimistic is, this is our best. If we are positive, if we expect the best, what happens in that scenario? If the baseline, the way things are now continues, what do we expect? If we are pessimistic, we expect that the worst happens, what happens, and how do we respond to the different scenarios? Now, the different scenarios present us with different options. So what a forecast tries to do is to give us the options available in a pessimistic situation, optimistic situation, and in a baseline situation. And I can take an example now. In terms of baseline, if China maintains her current consumption of oil and gas, what happens to Nigeria? If China increases her consumption of oil and gas, what happens to Nigeria? If China decreases or it goes down, her consumption of oil and gas, what happens to Nigeria? China is beginning to become our major trading partner in terms of demand for our oil and gas to fuel our local industry. So those different scenarios present different options and choices for us.
But I know you're not just going to sit down and wait till those happen. So how are you proceeding into the new year? What are those things that we can look forward to, apart from
now, the things under our control we're dealing with? One is a regulatory regime. Two, we're dealing with the issue of maritime security, which is critical if we want to achieve our goals for the maritime sector. We're also dealing with the operating environment itself. Now, that has to do with policies, has to do with regulations, has to do with dealing with infrastructure gaps, human skill. You know, we're dealing with those things. Those things are under our control. We're investing. Government is investing. Government is focusing on the ease of doing
there's more funding
business.
Going into, for instance, training. You said there's more funding, for instance, also, and especially actually security. Is more funding, or is that not a big issue?
We're investing more fund in maritime security because, unfortunately for us, lately Nigeria has been in the news for wrong reasons when they talk about maritime security.
I know, there's been the issue with, sea pirates and some sailors being abducted and all that.
We have codified our solution in what is called the Deep Blue Project. It's a four-pronged approach. You know, acquisition of assets, investment in maritime intelligence or maritime domain awareness assets, and of course building coalition and partnership, and finally building a legal framework.
Okay, but in terms of, specifically for security, how much maybe we can go into specifics. How much funding would you be expecting to go into it to acquire, and the role technology you just mentioned that is going to play in terms of...
well, this year we expect to spend 50% of 195 million US dollars in maritime security.
What about technology? Role technology is going to play?
Well, this is underpinned on technology.
Okay.
In terms of maritime domain awareness, having a bigger picture of what's going on in our maritime space and building response capability. All of that will be built on technology. And of course, we are investing in technology in terms of intelligence, in terms of response capability, in terms of monitoring.
I know for the water, I mean territorial and coastal, is there...
That's what is referred to as maritime domain awareness.
What about collaboration with other...
I said so, building critical partnership.
Okay. So going into the year, in terms of how it can also benefit the economy, those specific investments that could come into the sector that you're expecting will benefit the economy. Tell us about that.
Definitely, if we're able to crash the rate of piracy, there'll be upward swing in activities in our maritime space, and of course, will lead to employment creation, wealth creation, more assets acquisition. And so that's one thing. If we're able to intervene in terms of getting more funds available for the people, they acquire more assets. Acquisition of more assets means more persons getting involved in the sector, more skills needed, more to be supplied and support for the oil and gas industry.
How would you describe, looking at the state of Nigeria's maritime industry and comparing it to our neighbors or countries with similar economies as ours and similar aspirations in terms of how they also want to grow their maritime industry, how would you rate Nigeria?
Now, Nigeria is still the biggest maritime player in Africa. What people don't understand is that if you use only one yardstick, if you use the yardstick of ports alone, you're not right. You need to use minimum of 6 parameters to compare nations in terms of their maritime capability. In terms of connectivity, Egypt is number 1. In terms of tonnage, another country is number 1. In terms of receipt of cargo, South Africa is number 1. In terms of export, but if you do an average, you notice that Nigeria is still a force to reckon with in maritime in the continental shelf of Africa.
Now, you talked earlier when we first started, you talked about the big picture. Obviously, you want more participation by local players. You want funding to come in. You want increased capacity. So, I mean, just looking down the line, perhaps still on the big picture, what are your aspirations? What are your hopes in terms of how this industry could morph into that industry that would make Nigeria perhaps a hub or even a leader on the African continent?
Now, our aspirations are threefold. One is that how do we contribute more to Nigeria's GDP? Our target is to contribute 10% of Nigeria's GDP. One. To contribute more means you will expand your base of operation. How do we become African leader in the industry, undisputed African leader in the industry? That's another aspiration. How do we ensure that we're number 1 in terms of tonnage? We're number 1 in terms of cargo receipt. We're number 1 in terms of export. We're number 1 in terms of manpower exports. We're number 1 in terms of efficiency of our ports. We're number 1 in our operations. Those are things we're looking at.
So what I see is going down the line, at what point do you think we can... I know it's probably a difficult question because, I mean, it's all still in progress and in the works right now. But when you look into the future, how soon do you see this happening? That's where I'm going with this.
We're making a lot of progress, remarkable progress. Those in the industry understand we're making a lot of progress. In terms of regulation, continentally, we're acknowledged as doing very excellently, very well. In terms of cabotage regime, we're a model. In the continent of Africa today, every other country is learning from us. How are we operating our cabotage regime? And so in terms of cabotage regime, meaning inland trade, obviously everybody acknowledges the fact that in Africa, we're number 1. In terms of manpower, we're growing more than any other country on the continent of Africa. In terms of manpower, seafarers. I'm not saying we have the highest number of seafarers, but in terms of growth, if you look at the growth trajectory, we're doing better than any country in Africa.
I remember I asked you earlier, I was under the assumption that we had 3 deep sea ports, and you corrected me and said, no, we had 3 deep sea...
Ongoing projects.
Ongoing projects. Talk to us about that.
We don't have 3 deep sea
and I'm wondering, I mean, if we have such aspirations, I mean, what kind of progress can we make?
When we complete our 3 deep sea ports, it will significantly contribute to our place in maritime. Our rate in the maritime sector.
Where are we in terms of progress, and what is it? Is there a timeline in terms of how soon we're going to get there?
I can't put a time to it, but I think that we're making a lot of progress. And for once, we're more focused than ever.
Mr. Dakuku Peterside, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for talking to us. We appreciate your time on the show today. I've been speaking to Dakuku Peterside. He's the Director General of the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency, NIMASA, and we've been looking at the projected growth of the sector this year. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch our previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awuni. For myself and the rest of the team, do have a great day.